Okay, so getting back into our coverage over Captain America in 1998, we're going to go ahead and pick back up again with a few more issues. Now, here's the thing, because these issues are really more like one-shots, but the thing is they go together almost perfectly and tell an overarching story. And the thing is, in this storyline, we're kind of getting into the idea of Steve Rogers losing his shield and how it does affect him a whole lot. And then having to find a way to replace that shield with a different one. And so as we dive into issue number 2, you see, we're seeing Steve Rogers right now fighting against Hydra. Now, for me personally, this is kind of like a callback, and let me explain why. Because for Steve Rogers, as we all know, the dude fought against Hydra for many years. But prior to this storyline, for Steve, him and a few other characters, they were in a different reality, better known as Heroes Reborn. Now, while being in that reality, Steve still fought against Hydra. Like, let's not forget that. But it's the idea of him now being back in the main Marvel universe, and it's Marvel right now trying to get Steve to go back to his old ways again prior to Heroes Reborn. So it's the idea of him right now fighting against Hydra like he did back in the old days. Now, with that being said, we do learn here that for Hydra, they're right now planning to do a nuclear strike. And so for Steve, it's his job right now to stop them. But right after you have Steve being able to take down a few members of Hydra, you have this commander appear. Now, when the commander does appear, it's him right now informing Steve like, hey, listen, so when it comes to Hydra, they had just stolen this submarine. Now, with this submarine being stolen, they also stole this virus. With that virus now being gone as well, they now have the ability to knock out all different types of navigational systems the Navy use to kind of help them when it comes to protecting America. And so when that system is knocked out, that will allow Hydra a better chance to go off with their plan with a nuclear strike on America without any kind of counterattack from the Navy. And so what Steve now has to do, go underwater, find a submarine, and basically destroy it, because once it's gone, the virus will also go away as well, and also ruin the plans of Hydra and their nuclear strike. So that kind of leads into the rest of issue number 2, because again, issue number 2 is really more the idea of how Steve Rogers had lost his shield. And let me explain here, because when you do have Steve arrive on the submarine and begin to fight against more members of Hydra, throughout the whole time you have fighting against Hydra, you have the book constantly focused on the idea of his shield and how great his shield is, but also kind of like his shield is his partner when it comes to him fighting against different enemies. Now, we're also introduced to another commander, the one in charge of this submarine, and her name is Rebecca Houston. Now, this is her only appearance ever in Marvel Comics, but here's the thing, because she's technically going to be really responsible for the idea of why Steve will lose his shield by the end of this chapter. Because once you do have Steve, Rebecca, and the rest of her crew agree to work together to get one, everyone off the ship, but 2, to also set bombs on the ship as well to blow it up, you didn't have our heroes go through that plan. The problem is that once you do have our heroes being able to get outside the submarine right in time before it blows up, the problem is, as it did blow up, Rebecca got knocked out, and so she began to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And so Steve has to choose to hold on to his shield or to go ahead and save Rebecca. And of course, he chose to save Rebecca's life and swim back to the surface. The problem is that his shield continued to fall into the bottom of the ocean. And so once you do have Steve get back to the surface, for Steve, he feels now incomplete, because again, that shield was kind of like his partner. It was always with him. It always helped him in battle, but now it's completely gone at the bottom of the ocean. Now, I know you're thinking like, well, he can just call in Namor. He will in the next chapter. But you also have Mark Waid, the writer of the story, kind of give us a reason why Namor really can't help out with the idea of fighting his shield at the bottom of the ocean. And so as we dive into the next chapter, what we're seeing right now is really more of Hydra once again trying to get back at Steve Rogers for stopping their last plan. And so what you have right now is them completely taking over a museum. Now, with them doing that, you have police believe like, okay, cool, we got everyone out of there. We should be okay. And we do know that for Hydra, what they want to do is kind of set up a death trap for Steve Rogers. The problem is that they don't know that two kids did not get out of the actual museum at the moment. And so right now, they're stuck inside the museum with Hydra, while you have police waiting for Steve Rogers to show up. Now, as we do switch over to Steve Rogers, for Steve, is him right now trying to get used to the idea of having a shield, but it's not the original shield. This shield was made by Tony Stark, but the problem is Tony Stark just can't make it as his original one was. So for Steve, he does not have the right kind of shield to throw around when it comes to him being inside Avengers Mansion. Now, like I said earlier, when it came to Mark Waid, hit the mic there on accident. When it comes to Mark Waid, he basically gave us like a reason why Namor couldn't just go underwater and find a shield. The reason why, because one, it's the ocean, but also the fact too, like for Namor, he's just too busy at the moment to put anything aside to look for just one particular shield. Now for Steve, he does leave the mansion. And we also kind of get reminded of the idea that for Steve Rogers, with him being gone for a year because he was in the Heroes Reborn reality, that technically he became somewhat popular. He became an idol. And for Steve, this is something different. Like originally for Steve, it was always the idea of him being like a role model, and that was really it. But now the idea that he's being used for toys and clothes and all of these different types of things, for Steve, he's not really used to it. But as we do switch back over to Hydra in their main base, we do pick up with their new leader, their new Supreme Hydra person. And this person will not really be Supreme, he'll be the sensational Hydra. Now, this new character will become somewhat important for the later parts of our videos when it comes to our coverage over the 1998 Captain America run, but it's really him trying to establish the fact that he is now the new leader of this organization. And so once you do have Steve Rogers arrive at the museum, his main goal at the moment is to, stop Hydra and get them the heck out of that museum. But the problem is that once you do have him arrive at the museum, he realized that, well, there's two innocent children right now inside the museum, and they have been trying their best to hide from Hydra. Now, you do have Steve try his best to protect them, but unfortunately for Steve, he does end up getting shot in the shoulder. Now, in our last video, we had talked about the idea of Sharon Carter kind of finding out that, well, good old Steve Rogers was alive again. And so for that, you had her kind of be intrigued and want to go back to New York. And so this is her right now reactivating her shield status so that she's able to get back out there. And so we see her meeting up with the current Shield runners, because for Nick Fury, he was not around at this time in Marvel Comics. Now, the rest of this chapter, it's really more of us just now seeing Captain America being able to get back up, but you also have Steve Rogers use a replica of his old classic shield, more triangle shape, not the round shaped shield. And so once he has that shield back in his hand, it's kind of like muscle memory just basically helped him out when it comes to fighting against Hydra, because he remembers the days of using a shield very similar to the one he's using right now. And so with him having that shield, he was then able to take down Hydra, but to also save the kids' lives as well. So the day is saved, right? But then at the very end of this chapter, you now have the sensational Hydra, one of them call in Batroc, of course, as we know, a classic Captain America villain, but he tells his agents like, hey, go ahead and bring him in. And for a Hydra, they're kind of like, are you sure about this? Like, you want to call him in? Okay, kind of weird. And so now we get into the final chapter of this storyline where we're really picking up with Steve Rogers working with Hawkeye to stop Hydra once again when it comes to them trying to release nerve gas. I just realized something like so far in this series, we have seen nerve gas being used now twice. And we're only 4 issues in. But anyways, though, when it comes to Steve Rogers, you have him and Hawkeye working together to make sure that nerve gas is not released into the public. And so once you do have the two characters being able to work together and bring down a few more members of Hydra, you then have Steve be confronted by this congressman who wants to use Steve as a way to help him with his campaign to an election. Now, of course, Steve Rogers, he straight up says, no, I'm not going to do that as well. But it also kind of shows that with the idea of Steve Rogers being back, that he's no longer just a role model, that he's now an idol, that he's now this guy out there that can be used for different kinds of marketing schemes. Now, for Steve Rogers, he's also kind of wondering, like, how can he be able to go out in public without the idea of people noticing who he is? Because with the idea of him now being almost super famous, it's kind of hard for him now to go out in public, be just a regular person. Now, for Hawkeye, he does try his best to show Steve, like, not to be really bothered by the idea of being popular, because you do have Hawkeye take Steve out, right? And you do have him say, like, hey, you know what, just don't wear the outfit, wear a coat, you'll be okay. And technically he was right. But while being out there, you have Steve just seeing all these different props and other merchandise out there with the idea of him now being famous and being used for, well, marketing or merchandise sales. And so for Hawkeye, he's enjoying this because he knows it ticks off Steve Rogers a whole lot. But for Steve, he hates the idea of what he's seeing. He's seeing all these commercials and more toys. He's just like, man, why is this happening? Like, can it please stop? And now we have to switch back over to Sharon Carter. Now for Sharon, it's really her being upset about the idea that Nick Fury had cut her off when she was on a mission. And so for her, she wants to find Nick Fury to figure out why he did that. Now she did find this file, and this file is really important. But she finds out that apparently his corpse was relocated somewhere else. And so now she's wondering what in the world is going on with the body of Nick Fury. Now for Steve Rogers, while he's out there still with Hawkeye, it's really him kind of wondering, like, what can he do now as Captain America? And what I mean by that statement, it's really more of Steve saying, like, okay, what can I do now to help out this nation? How to be more proactive, to get out there more. And so we're seeing Steve Rogers really sit down and actually process that. But while trying to do that, he realized that one of his classic villains had just popped up again, and that would be Bedrock. And so you do have Steve Rogers try his best to fight against him in the middle of the city. But while you have the two characters fighting against one another, well, you have the sensational Hydra watching this battle and kind of enjoying it. Now we do jump over to this island, and when we do, we really pick up with these two guys on the island talking about the idea of the Red Skull just not coming back. Well, the funny thing about it, the Red Skull does come back, but in a very unique type of way. He's this shadow creature who kills off both men on this island. But either way, though, the Red Skull has officially returned to Marvel Comics. But now we have to switch back over to Captain America, who's currently fighting against his, well, classic enemy, Bedrock. And I really hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm trying to say it more in the French way, but I'm pretty sure I'm butchering it. Either way, while you have the two fighting against each other, he does inform Steve Rogers that this fight is going to end with Steve Rogers winning. And the reason why, because he was paid to lose the battle against Steve Rogers. Now for Steve, he's kind of wondering why in the world would anybody pay to allow him to win against a villain like that? But the thing is, it's also showing Steve Rogers that while he was gone, his enemies got better. They got stronger. They got faster. They learned new skills. They are now completely different than how they were in the past. And Steve is still also learning how to use his old classic shield all over again. And so even though you do have Steve win the battle, technically he didn't win because he was paid to win. Not him, but of course the guy was paid to lose to help him win. What Hydra is trying to do is build up Steve Rogers. And the reason why, because the bigger he is, the harder they fall. And so he believes that once you have, the Supreme Hydra or Sensational Hydra, believes that once Steve Rogers is currently at a high position in his life, that once he drops, it's going to hurt him a whole lot more. But this is where we're going to end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next time. Later.